I never knew my grandfather, but there's a legend about him, which I seem to reproduce in my own life. He was very involved with the Haskalah, and he was an artisan. He carved chairs, and elaborate, fancy, filigreed chairs. But the story goes that he died before my birth, so it is a story. The story goes that the Haskalah periodicals would come in the morning. He would start reading them. The sun would set, and he never got to work. So this happens to me very often. You know, I start reading, and before I turn around, it's 2 a.m., and that's when I start. So I think some of the grandfather's tendencies have come down to me.
And you also had an uncle, Abraham Regelson.
Yes, my mother's brother, right.
How did the knowledge of having an uncle who was a literary figure affect your own ambitions or your own identity as a writer?
I think very definitely there was an influence, not a direct influence, but simply to know when you're very small that there is such a thing as a literary life makes all the difference. I mean, I don't know if it fed an ambition. I don't think so, but I think just the knowledge that there is this kind of life. Of course, he had 5 children. It was the Depression, and I remember him saying, "I want to be a Hebrew poet, but I have to be a Yiddish journalist to feed the family." So, and my maternal grandmother, Rachel, after whom my daughter's partly named, lived with us and was a huge, huge influence on me. She read me, before I could read myself, she read me the Tzena Urena, and those stories are as good as Grimm's fairy tales. So she was very, very influential on me. She was very pious, very observant, but never in a coercive way. Never, never. Very gentle, giving, generous person.
How did you get the name Cynthia?
Well, things are different today, but my mother took me to school, PS 71 in the Northeast Bronx, and they said, take her home and get her. My name is Shoshana, and I called Shoshana by my close friends and relatives and husband, and that's who I really, truly am. But they said, take her home and give her an American name. So they came up with Cynthia. I have, in effect, 2 identities, and you might say one is a public one and one is a private one. Not a secret one, but a private one.
The name, then, the Cynthia and the Shoshana, gives you both the Hellenistic and the Hebraic, which we can talk about later on.
That's right.
But have you thought about the duality in your name as a kind of interesting early determinism in the way you think about the world?
That's interesting. It may be subliminal. It has never been conscious, but it might very well be a kind of arcane, hidden clue that I haven't been aware of until this very moment. Yeah. And talk about being turned back the first day of school, go get her an American name. When I came to be registered by my grandmother in the Cheder, I was the first girl child who had ever been there, and a very ancient, to me, looking rabbi told my Baba, Nem Yirahem Amedol Dafnish Lernen, take her home, a girl doesn't have to learn. And so I was chased away, but I came back the next day, and I don't know what happened overnight, some kind of revolution, and there I was, year after year with the bar mitzvah boys. They would have their bar mitzvah and vanish, and I would start again with the next bar mitzvah class. So I never really got very far.
So you were the only girl in class from the age of 6?
Or I guess 5. I guess I was 5 when I started, and then I was, for the most part, the only Jew in my class in the public school. So it was, in that sense, a kind of marginalizing experience. I never had a Jewish friend until I went to high school. And I remember vividly a conversation that I had with a little friend of Italian background. She was 6 and I was 5. We were talking about deicide. And since she was logical and generous and kind and smart, she said to me, "You didn't do it, Cynthia." So I was absolved because, you know, I obviously wasn't there 2,000 years ago, which is mostly what Vatican II said. I remember other conversations where sitting over lunch once, a boy said to me, when I said the Bible was written in Hebrew, he said, "That's impossible. The Jews had nothing to do with the Bible." So, it's Christian. So, you know, there was a lot of this, what shall we call it, street metaphysics.
Yeah. What did you do at Christmas time?
That was always a problem. I wouldn't sing the carols in Friday Assembly. So I was called up and made to stand on the stage in disgrace because I wouldn't sing the carols. And though I explained I may not, I will not, I cannot sing the carols because I'm Jewish, I was punished for it anyway. I don't know whether that was malice or simple stupidity on the part of the teacher who pulled me out. But when I got a little older, I would say about 11, 12, I systematically, on Christmas Eve, began to write essays. Every single year on Christmas Eve, I wrote an essay contra Christmas. I found that very relieving, actually. And what those essays were about, they were simply analyses of Christianity and how it simply could not fly logically. And I did this every single year. But I also remember being much, much younger and wanting to write a Christmas story, I think around the age of 8. And I wanted, the drugstore sold chocolate Santa Clauses, and I had the idea for a story called The Chocolate Santa Claus, and I felt guilty about wanting to write it. And I asked my mother, "Do you think I can write a story about a chocolate Santa Claus?" And she said, "Yes." So I did.
So you did.
So I did.
Do you have that story?
No. No. Well, I remember it melted. That was the crisis of the story.
How observant was your household, was the family, when you were a child?
Well, I was called from the Stecken as pious as rigidly pious as a stick as a child. My parents, I remember on one occasion using my father for a Shabbos guy. So I think I was reading in bed, and it was Friday night, and he came home. It was very late, and the light was on, and I said, "Papa, please turn out the light," and he did. Yeah. And it meant very little to him to turn out the light or turn on the light, because obviously he was in the pharmacy and doing business and all of this. So, and I think many Jews of that generation who had to make a living could not be observant. I'm not quite sure that my father would have been anyway. I was in deep bliss in high school. These were war years. I was so happy in high school. I look back at those years and I think if I had been there rather than where I was, I would not be. And it's a puzzle for me. It's a perplexity that during those most horrible years of Jewish annihilation, I was happy in a New York high school.
What was the source of that bliss? What changed from PS 71 to high school?
I just was in a state of bliss to find myself in a place where learning was valued and encouraged, and it was an all-girls school, and there was this, to use this word, there was this sense of total entitlement, both as a female, both as and as a mind. I suddenly discovered that I was intelligent, which I had never known before, never known because of that elementary school education.
Yes. So then you finished high school and you went on to NYU, went on to college.
I was a garden variety English major. And
when did Henry James come into the picture? At NYU or only later?
Yes, no, I think when I was a senior in high school, my brother, this is odd, my brother brought home a science fiction anthology from the library, and for some reason it had The Beast in the Jungle in it. And I read that story, and again, for some reason, I thought it was autobiographical. I thought it was the story of my life, which is something that a 17-year-old might not think. Because, you know, of course, that it's you're a Jamesian also, that it's about a man who expects something remarkable to happen to him and then discovers that the remarkable thing that happened to him, he discovers at the end of his life, is that nothing remarkable has ever happened to him, that he's never had any experience at all. And I thought that was going to be my life, or was already my life.
And when you completed your degree in English literature and decided to go on to do graduate work in English literature, did you feel at that time that you were embarking on an academic career, or it seemed the natural thing to do because you loved literature and you had finished one degree? And
I wanted to teach that. I wanted to teach literature. I really wanted to do that. And so I got a teaching assistantship at Ohio State University. And you had to do a master's thesis, and I did mine on the late novels of Henry James. And I had some kind of thesis about, you know, parable being a moral system. And I systematized James.
So you were drawn to him aesthetically, but then you
I
want to make this
converted
bridge
him
between
to a
these.
Jew.
Yes, right.
I think I did
Maybe
that.
he was to begin with, but it was bringing together the aesthetics and the
Yes.
moral position.
Yes,
in
right. And the
James.
emphasis was surely on the moral. Absolutely.
Yes, right.
And you had to appear before a committee of 3, which I did. And then I was called in by the chairman of the department, and I was certain he was going to persuade me to continue and get the PhD. And I had prepared myself to argue against it. Instead, he told me to go home and get married. It was very shocking.
That was a general policy toward the female graduate students.
Surely. So that was very insulting. And I suppose for spite I should have gone on, but no, I went home to write.
Yes.
Doing all the wrong things, you know, isolating oneself and not becoming part of the literary world, staying home alone and reading and writing. At that time I was reading 16 hours a day and writing all night. But this was the time of mailer, Sontag, Updike. I mean, this is my whole chevra, so to speak. And I was, you know, up there in the northeastern Bronx, living in my parents' house, married, but living in my parents' house. And the novel was, you know, this sacred thing. It was, I wasn't very Jewish then. That was my religion. Because in those years, I had a tremendous, it's very contradictory. I had enormous humiliation because of not being published, and I had at the same time a sense of completely unused and very hidden powers, high powers. I don't have that feeling anymore. I sort of know my literary place. I think that was an aspect of the, you know, youthful ambition, which always overestimates itself. Without the early, and I hesitate even to use the word recognition, but the early sense that you're in the world of your contemporaries, of your writing contemporaries, without being in it, early on, you never feel you're in it. You never feel you're in it.
So the prizes and the exposure hasn't changed the way in which you see yourself as a writer, or has it affected the way in which you write?
Well, I'm very grateful for them, there's no question, and they bring me pleasure, and to say anything else would be utterly false. But I find that they also make me blue, because they make me feel so unachieved, you know, and what I suffer from is, I guess, very commonplace without being a writer, but I suffer from youth envy in the sense that the young writers have so many more decades to work than I do, and this, of course, is a non-acceptance of the human condition, obviously, but I'm always feeling just starting, and it comes as a real shock to me that I'm no longer a young writer, that I'm an old writer, and when I haven't begun, and to confront oneself in the mirror and see essentially one's own mother is so astonishing to know that I haven't begun, and that I'm this young writer who's still working and not getting there. And so the prizes, of which I've had a number of late, are enormously gratifying, but they don't mean recognition for some reason. That's what I said earlier. If you haven't published when you're young, there is a sense of unfulfillment that stays forever. It's not rational.
Let's go back to your first novel, Trust,
Mm-hmm.
and the way in which that in embryo has generated really the major themes throughout your works.
Mm-hmm.
The daughter in search of a father, a Greek father,
Mm-hmm.
a Hebraic father,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hellenism, Hebraism,
Mm-hmm.
Pan, Moses,
Right.
Cynthia, Shoshana.
Well, there are two fathers in Trust. There's Enoch, the Jew, and there's Nick, who's sort of the old Nick, the devil-may-care character, who is very, very pagan, very Greeky, and who ends by drowning and sort of becoming a water god in that sense. I think at that point, all I wanted to do was write a novel, and I didn't know where I was going, and there was no consciousness of theme. I wanted to write, like every kid, I wanted to write a great American novel. So it's not a great novel, but I think that those themes were apparently endemic. What I thought I was writing about was trust in a contradictory way, because nobody is trustworthy in that book. There's betrayal upon betrayal and betrayal, so the title was ironic. That's what I thought I was writing about. But you are absolutely right. I was not writing about that. That's what I consciously thought I was writing about, and I was writing about fairy tales. The water god, the free sexuality of the Greek spirit. I was so drawn to the pagan freedom, even to the idea of the incestuous freedom, the sexuality which is utterly free and utterly perverse and utterly forbidden in the Jewish view. I mean, it really is asur. And so I think I was forming, just as you have suggested, forming a formulation that I did not know at the time I was formulating. Now you may ask, and I ask myself right now, why am I so attracted to the pagan world? And I think because it is the world of image making, it is the world of imagination, it is everything that is unrestrained. And Jews are under enormous restraints, the restraints of civilization. And this may be stylized, may be fableized Greek vision is unrestrained, total and complete unrestraint. And I think the Jew in me may be rebelling even now, since I am writing about heretics. And why the interest in heresy? I suppose maybe I need a course in maybe I need a shrink to find out. I'll never find out.
Boundary crossings, yeah.
the desire to be transgressive.
Yes.
I mean, some people believe that, I believe it, that writers by definition are transgressive.
There's the fascination with paganism, but there's also a fascination with Christianity, and there's so much Christianity in your works. How so? And when you think about it, do you think in terms of its being a form of idolatry for Jews? This is the great other. This is the most demonic idol. The one
There's so much work.
tempting.
The question is a very rich one, because there's so much work being done today on Jewish origins of Christianity, and there's a lot of scholarship behind it, and the scholarship seems very persuasive. My ideas about Christianity were formed before this scholarship ever got into the world, and even with the scholarship, you come to, you can say Jewish, 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 and then you come to the fact of the divinity of Jesus, and that's the stopping point. You just cannot get beyond that. The dying God who's resurrected is the old Nile God, and the mystery religions with the Eucharist. I mean, it is a mystery religion, and of course this, I remember saying that in my little polemic against Christianity, that Christianity is a pimple on the rump of Buddhism because of the mystical qualities of it. But Buddhism has, it's so interesting, has almost exactly the same analysis, of the world that Judaism has, but namely that it's a veil of tears. And Buddhism, however, decides that you go and step out of the world, and Judaism says you go fix it. But I think these are the two really respectable ways to confront ontology. And Christianity seems quite primitive compared to that. Some of my best friends are Christians.
So of course you want to be judged and deserve to be judged as an individual writer, creating these imaginary worlds. But for the purposes of public debate and cultural debate, you are comfortable being addressed or labeled as a Jewish writer.
I'm uncomfortable with Jewish writer for a lot of reasons. One is very rooted. Well, first of all, I think that I hardly know where to begin with this. Jewish writing seems to me to be Torah, Talmud, learned texts. This to me is Jewish writing. Fiction, how does this count as Jewish writing? What is Jewish about it? A second objection is, though I will never quarrel with the phrase on any superficial level, because I don't want it to be taken for a kind of self-hate, which it sometimes is if you say, don't call me a Jewish writer, I'm not a Jewish writer. Yes. This is exactly the opposite of self-hate. It's wanting precision in the meaning of what is Jewish writing. And secondly, I see such a division between what a Jew is and what a writer is. A Jew is a person who responds to a civilized mandate, which you can express either very directly through a Torah heritage or in a more diluted form in the kind of civilized values that ultimately derive from Jewish ideas, Jewish moral ideas. So that's what a Jew is. But what is a writer, particularly a fiction writer? A fiction writer, you have villains when you write fiction, and when you have villains, you enter into the evil. You actually, it's essentially avodah zarah, because you enter into unknown, occult, evil places. Yesterday, when somebody was telling me about some of the superstitious way out religious practices that are surfacing in Israel today, somebody mentioned holy robes. Someone told me about a woman who sells red strings at the Western Wall to ward off the evil eye. Well, as a Jew, I respond to this with horror. Go away. What kind of avodah zarah, this terrible pagan stuff? As a writer, I think, oh, wow, holy robes. What are those? I want those holy robes. And so the writer is the Vilde Chaya, and the Jew is the person who carries the mandate of civilization, the decent citizen. The writer is not the decent citizen. And so I see this phrase, Jewish writer, as a tremendous oxymoron.
What about the faith aspect?
Well, it seems to me that if you're Jewish, you don't have to worry so much about faith. After all, since you're asked not to visualize God, this alone is a kind of anti-faith position. In other words, the decent commerce, so to speak, between human beings is what matters, but the secret things, all the questions about the nature of God, is not human business.
Could you look at the pagan rabbi as a moral fable?
Oh, absolutely. But the thing is, what I really dug in that was the dryad. I wrote that not for the sake of the rabbinic side, but for the sake of the dryad. The moment I remember, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was pondering, how would the dryad speak? How would she communicate? How would the pagan rabbi hear the thoughts of the dryad? It was really a complex problem. I did not know. I had no insight. Suddenly, it came to me. It would be olfactory. Of course, she's a flower. She's botanical. So, of course, it would be through the sense of smell. And that insight gave me so much ecstasy that, though it's many decades, I think, later, I can still feel that sense of bliss in the dryad. I mean, it's the holy robes, it's the lady with the strings, it's the dryad that excites the imagination. I mean, that's what I think the imagination is probably pagan at the root. And there must be a reason that the rabbis rejected Haskalah.
I'd like to move into another territory, a much more difficult one to discuss, and that is the territory of the Holocaust or the concentration camp world. When did you know that you had to write about that experience? Although, as you put it before, those were your finest years, your years of bliss when you were in high school, and then you, of course, felt the road not taken.
Yes. Well, the 5-page story called The Shawl was some kind of, well, one calls it automatic writing. Of course, it isn't that. I just felt something beyond me that made me write those 5 pages, made me imagine them. And I think it's pretty serious in a negative way to have done that. I wasn't there. I didn't experience it. I read about it. I found in William Shirer's big, thick book that he wrote post-war, I found a sentence, just one sentence, as I was reading that book, though it was many years before I wrote The Shawl, something about a baby being thrown against an electrified fence in a camp. And that image stayed with me, and so I wrote these 5 pages in the voice, in a sense, of somebody who had experienced that. And I'm not sure, I've never been sure that that was a legitimate thing for me to do.
It's a very, very moving story. And you said that one of the first genres that you were interested in when you were first beginning to write was the fairy tale. And there is a fairy tale tone or some of the way that it develops in some way. Is that to keep it at a distance? Is it the goblet and the domino and the butterfly and the, is that Rosa's denial of what is happening? Why that choice of
know.
language?
I don't know. These are questions that, come from the critical intellect, and I don't know. I mean, I could retrospectively seize on what you say about those images and say, oh yes, right, they are sort of metaphorical fairy tale images, but it wouldn't quite be truthful because it would be looking backward. I don't know how I wrote that. I really.
You gave her your name. Did you? So was that Rosa Shoshana?
I never thought of
You
that.
didn't.
I never thought of that. No. I just took it because it was a sort of European sounding name, which was easy to deal with. Right.
The second part, where you cast a sharp satirical eye on certain kinds of American discourse, especially the psychologist,
Well, I'd had a real experience. I'd had a letter from a psychiatrist who wrote to me and about the little piece called The Shawl, and he was actually a psychoanalyst, and he said that you were writing from your own experience, and I wrote back to him and said no, and he wrote back and said, you are showing survival syndrome of denial, and you are a survivor, but you will not admit it. And I thought there was such a kind of arrogance in these assumptions that, and it troubled me so much because he also wrote me that the reason he knew this was he worked all the time as a therapist for survivors. He was somewhere in Michigan where there were a lot of survivors, and he worked all the time with them, and that's why he understood why I was denying, because he'd encountered this as a kind of psychosis in traumatized patients. And I thought, what is he doing to these people if he writes to me this way with this absolute surety that he knows what is contrary to fact? And I thought, how can he help people? So out of him developed Dr. Tree.
Yes, but I wonder, going back to what you said about your childhood, whether the Jewish consciousness of being the only Jewish child in class and so on, whether that gets translated into a Europeanness. You're an American writer, you were born in the United States, and Europe, both as a landscape and as a cultural milieu, as intellectual force, plays a very important role. And you do write about Europe, as you said, because it's part of the intellectual and cultural baggage of
And
the
you
Jew.
may have given me another reason. Is it a stand-in for the Jewish immersion in history? That's truly an insight for me. You mean Europe as a stand-in for Jewish?
As not
even
America.
aside from the Holocaust?
Yeah.
Well, it's not quite so aside, is it?
It's not so aside, right.
Yeah. Well, I think you've hit on something. After all, the Jewish mindset is set in history, and America throws off its history. The minute history happens, it's gone. Things go away. And maybe that is the attraction to Europe, because Europe is steeped in history and Jewish blood.
So betrayal of one's Jewish identity is a thread that runs throughout much of your writing, and including the writing dealing with the Holocaust.
Well, I mean, America is an echo of Germany before the catastrophe. There's no question. Everyone says America is different. I feel that because of the institutions, but I do feel that the institutions are being undermined, as we spoke earlier, by the fact that we now do groupthink in a rivalrous and destructive manner, and that victimology is a very big deal now in American culture.
So there is no need to convert in a religious sense, but there are other kinds of conversions and crossing of lines.
There are other kinds. You can convert to American triviality, American unseriousness, American alienation from history. I mean, that's what the Jews have converted to in America. A complete ahistorical living in the present moment and according to the values which are concentrated on the present.
Then what is your argument against assimilation, since you clearly denounce it over and over again in your books?
Well, I don't think think I actually have an argument, and maybe the only argument is the principle of the saving remnant.
Yes.
I mean, one wants volunteers, not coerced people. And I mean, you have to believe that there is some value in the heritage. You don't have to be a religious Jew to know that there's value in it, to feel that there's value in it. I think civilization is the key word. I mean, not only Jews have a mandate to civilization, but that would be totally erroneous to say, but Jews do have a mandate for civilization and an obligation toward it. And I think by and large, though we are very flawed people, I think by and large we express it. Who was it who said, "A klein folk ober a paskudnia"? So
Yes.
somebody quoted I thought it was Dubno, but no, the famous quote from Dubno, the historian, was Jeden schreib. That was, you know.
And for your Yiddish in America, did that come to you as an idea or as a character, as memory?
Jacob Glotstein decided that I had written about him. It wasn't Glotstein. It was, no, I had been translating the Yiddish poets, and I was very, very involved with them and their sense of alienation. But the real source of that was something called, it's true that I didn't know very much about the Yiddish poets and their society and their lives. I knew their poems, and so I was able to make use of that. But the germ, the absolute seed of that, came from the 1930s, when there was a coterie called the Hebrew Poetry Society of America, in which my uncle was an active member, and they published a little periodical which appeared sort of, not on a regular basis, but now and then when maybe they had money to pay the printer. And I went to, as a child, to a couple of those meetings. The Hebrew Poetry Society of America was so alone in the world. Everybody in it eventually came here to live on Aliyah, except one, and who, the story is, couldn't leave his mother. And I saw their world. I saw their jealousies. I mean, such a tiny little group, and the situation between them was comical in a tragic way.
But you turned it into Yiddish, and by turning it into Yiddish in a post-Holocaust story, it got an entirely different dimension, didn't it?
That's right. Because it's dying out and represents the people of Europe who were murdered. I am truly, truly an idolater, because when I ask myself, it's curious, not in our conversation, it has not come out in this conversation, but in private conversations that I have with myself, I often admit to myself, I ask myself in the hierarchy between writer and Jew, what is your primary identity?
Yes.
And would you like to take a stab at what I answer myself?
No. I wouldn't venture to guess.
Well, I do say writer.
Yes.
And that may, in the context we have here and in everything we've discussed in this conversation, it may seem bizarre and contradictory. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but that is truly and really my primary identity. I am enthralled to the sentence, what matters to me more than anything? Are you going to say, oh, does it matter to you more than the continued life of Israel? What a terrible thing to say. But that's I mean, there's a citizen here, and there's a writer here, and for the writer, the sentence matters more than absolutely anything. And for the citizen, Jewish, I almost use that American slogan, Jewish continuity. No, I won't use that sloganeering, but the Jewish mandate, let's put it, is primary. But there are two elements here, and one rejects the other. I mean, each rejects the other. I mean, the writer just wants to be this free beast, this wild animal, and the Jew just wants to be this decent citizen. I so much distrust myself. I think I'm a liar. I think that's what fiction writing really is, as you said, impersonation, which is a version of lying. And I'm plagued at home by the Jewish community at large also, because sometimes I get called a Jewish spokesperson, and I can't be that. I can't be that. I'm not reliable enough. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not. I can't be that. I'm just a writer, and I don't think it's right for a writer to be a public spokesperson. Though.
Why would Updike be impersonating when he writes a Jewish novel, and Philip Roth not be impersonating because one is Jewish and the other isn't? Is there some essential identity that gets into the fiction which makes it less impersonating?
Well, I think what Updike did was take sociological clues. What he did with the Beck stories, you know, he's a religious writer. He's a Christian writer. Yes. He's never called a Christian American writer, but he's truly a Christian American writer. And in Dreaming Up Beck, he took all these sociological cues from assimilated, you know, sort of disassociated Jewish writers, of which there are scads, Dr. O, for example, and I took him to task. This was a long time ago, and I was much more involved in zealotry than I am today. I took him to task in this review for removing the essential Jewish core of the Beck character. All his other, it wouldn't have mattered had his non-Jewish characters not had a metaphysical religious core. But he chose the one character he's ever had who is not involved with the God question is the Jew. And I thought that was significant. And it turned out that he was very angry at me, and he wrote a story in which I talked to him about it, in which he lashed back at me by putting my words into a character whom he then killed, whom he then poisoned, right? And he confessed that he poisoned me in this fiction, and because I had pointed out in a very long ago review, which he well remembered, that this story that he wrote was about killing reviewers. And I wasn't the only reviewer he killed in that story. There was a whole bunch of them. But mine was particularly cleverly designed to be painful.
I understand you once had something very interesting to say about Norman Mailer's obsession with virility. Is it something you would like to tell us about?
Well, this is in the category of feminism. He had written excuse me, in advertisements for myself that a writer needs nothing so much as a penis, or the writer is inferior. So there was a big town hall discussion between Germaine Greer and Norman Mailer. It was attended by enormous press, and there was a video camera operating and all of this, and then there were questions from the audience. And so I raised my hand and said, Mr. Mailer, when you use your penis to write, what color ink do you dip it in? He very, very cleverly said, recognizing sort of the audience laughter and the impact of that question, he said, yellow. I thought that was very clever.
That was very clever.
Yes.
Yes. The essay on Anne Frank, which is so powerful and I think so important, did that begin with outrage or with anger?
Yes, I wrote in white rage. Absolutely. Garson Kanin, who did not want to identify Anne Frank as Jewish, he was the director, said it would be special pleading to identify her as Jewish. Imagine after the Holocaust he said special pleading? I mean, it's just inconceivable. So, I mean, these were a word I got in trouble for using in the Anne Frank essay. I used the word about Otto Frank, her father. I called him, instead of calling him an assimilated Jew, I used the word deracinated. And Ian Baruma, in discussing the play and the whole Anne Frank business, I hate to use that word, but the history of Anne Frank said that I had used Nazi language because I used the word deracinated. That was so upsetting for me to be accused in the pages of the New York Review of Books of using Nazi vocabulary. It was so mean-spirited.
You've said a few times today that I got into trouble for this or I got into trouble for that.
Right.
Do you think of yourself as being courageous? I mean, you say things with great conviction, and very often they're against the going fashions, and I read some of these essays and I think, what courage?
I agree with you, absolutely. But that word is often applied to me in a political context.
You're, am I right, in some ways a shy person, and in other ways, as I said, this strong conviction, and you make public statements.
Mm-hmm.
Is it difficult to
Terribly,
make those statements?
terribly. It's my mother and father fighting in me. When I was a child, I went to the library and I found two books by the same author, and I brought it home to show my parents. My mother is a violent woman. My father is a timid man, the name of these books. And my father was very reticent, and my mother wanted, as my father used to accuse her, stellen de Welt auf den Recht.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, she put on signboards to go demonstrate against Kissinger at one point, and there I was on my knees to her. I mean, she was an old lady. Mama, please don't go into this crowd. Mama, they'll shoot you. Mama, so anyway, she didn't go, but she made the signboard. And so I feel that my violent mother and my timid father are at war in me. And when there's a moment when, whatever the subject, when it is requisite for somebody to stand up and say something, I force myself to do it. I get pains in the spine. I get my bowel dissolves. I mean, it is terribly, terribly, terribly hard. And you're right. There is this war between I suppose what I regard as moral necessity and absolute fear of doing something disruptive in public. And that's why fiction is such a godsend, because you can do whatever you want there, and there's no consequence to it. It's only paper. And I'm home, and I'm sitting in my chair at my desk, and it's perfectly safe, and I can be as violent as I like on paper.
The territory of women's writing.
Mm-hmm.
You're comfortable with the label of Jewish writer, but not woman writer.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain why?
Yes, I've been asked that many times, and I think the reason is evident to me, though apparently not to others, because women's studies is, roughly speaking, very roughly speaking, gender, as we say nowadays, anatomical, and Jewish is intellectual. And I mean, one is mind and one is body. And women's studies has really become almost body studies in many cases, or a branch of sociology, which is fine, but it isn't. I call myself a classical feminist, meaning the old-fashioned kind, which would. What would happen, or what is happening, if we have the category of women writer, and that means that everybody who gets called writer is a man?
Yes, but your classical feminism makes its way into your work, doesn't it? A female golem, a great many female characters.
Well, surely Punter Messer is a feminist, yes.
How did the idea of the female golem come to you? From reading Jewish sources and texts?
Well, of course, I began with Gershom Scholem's. And he has a wonderful essay on the making of a golem, which he compares. I believe at Hebrew University, there maybe it was the first computer, and he compared that the robot to the golem, and of course that is a famous and fascinating legend, and Mark Podwall, the dermatologist slash artist, did some illustrations on, he collaborated with Elie Wiesel and did some illustrations, and I was struck by his illustrations of the golem. But why should it be Why should it be a male creature? Why could it not be a woman creature? I mean, that just seemed, it seemed time, time to have a female golem. Xantippe, right? Yeah.
Why
Xantippe. Why Xantippe was Socrates' shrewish wife, and I thought it might just be comical to name this shrewish golem after Socrates' wife, since she had that kind of chutzpah. So.
There's a tradition of female golem created to serve the sexual appetites of the male. Were you aware of Jewish traditions concerning the female golem when you wrote this?
No, no, this is news to me. I thought I manufactured the first one. No.
Well, it's fascinating then that you decided to write about a female golem. It's also quite fascinating that you decided to kill her off at the time in which her own sexual appetites had gotten wild.
She did become a kind of Greek figure at this point because of the sexual appetites. But I didn't know what else really to do with her, and she started having these raving appetites, and she got out of control. But that, of course, is in the tradition of the traditional male golem, gets out of control and must be undone. So I was, following the script as far as that goes. The sexuality, that's fascinating because the sexuality of my female golem was applied to preying on men. There was one moment, the golem was 15, and my daughter was then 15. And we, one evening, got together and I read them the Annihilation of the Golem. And as I was reading the golem's plea to Puttermesser, her lawyer maker, oh, mother, please do not undo me, as she worked the spell of creation backward and returned the golem to her original clay, I looked at my daughter and tears were coming down as I was reading, oh, mother, do not undo me, and I think she felt I was murdering her. She was identifying with the golem whom I had described as a 15-year-old girl.
How does your family fare with you being a writer, and how does it affect them, your husband, your daughter?
You asked about family. I did not have that baby until, I guess, I was married 13 or 14 years, I think 14 years. I was not at all interested in procreation, except literary procreation. I was, again, I was an idolater. I mean, I was kneeling at the altar of literature, and I was not interested. But then relatives would say, when is she having a baby? I was so angry that I guess I can't repeat what I would say to my relatives because it's not repeatable for a record, so I won't. I think I should censor myself on this. And also, I had a friend, a mathematician who was busy doing mathematics in the world, who called me at that time when I, in my own eyes, was sitting home writing, struggling, writing. She called me a housewife. When Trust came out, there was a review in Time magazine. They had a special issue in those days, in those more literary days. They had a special issue devoted to first novels. And they gave Trust a really rave review, and they said it was Tolstoyan, this extravagant language, which was very thrilling. All of this was undermined by the fact that they made me a year older than I was. They said I was 38, I was 37, which was very hard to take. And then they also referred to me as a housewife. So my husband, Bernard, wrote a letter to Time magazine in which he testified that I was indeed not a housewife, and he gave witness to why I was not. He discussed, the unwashed dishes and the unmade beds, but of course I was the ghostwriter for that letter. and they did publish that letter, and that was my vengeance on the housewife. But it was very hard to stay home and be a woman and achieve respectability as a writer. I mean, any male who was home writing was a writer.
Yes.
Any female who was home writing was a housewife. When we ask who the essayists are, it turns out, though novelists may now and then write essays, that true essayists rarely write novels. Essayists are a species of metaphysician. They are inquisitive, also analytic, about the least grain of being. Novelists go about the strenuous business of marrying and burying their people, or else they send them to sea, or to Africa, or, at the least, out of town. Essayists in their stillness ponder love and death. It is probably an illusion that men are essayists more often than women, especially since women's essays have in the past frequently assumed the form of unpublished correspondence. And here I should, I suppose, add a note about maleness and femaleness as a literary issue, what is popularly termed gender, as if men and women were French or German tables and sofas. I should add such a note. It is the fashion, or rather, the current expectation or obligation, but there is nothing to say about any of it. Essays are written by men, essays are written by women. That is the long and the short of it. Essays, unlike novels, emerge from the sensations of the self. Fiction creeps into foreign bodies. The novelist can inhabit not only a sex not his own, but also beetles and noses and hunger artists and nomads and beasts, while the essay is, as we say, personal. And here is an irony. Though I have been intent on distinguishing the marrow of the essay from the marrow of fiction, I confess I have been trying all along in a subliminal way to speak of the essay as if it or she were a character in a novel or a play, moody, fickle, given on a whim to changing her clothes or the subject, sometimes obstinate with a mind of her own, or hazy and light, never predictable. She may have recognizable contours, but she is highly colored and individuated. She is not a type. She is too fluid, too elusive to be a category. She may be bold, she may be diffident, she may rely on beauty or on cleverness, on eros or exotica. Whatever her story, she is the protagonist, the secret self's personification. When we knock on her door, she opens to us. She is a presence in the doorway. She leads us from room to room. Then why should we not call her she? She may be privately indifferent to us, but she is anything but unwelcoming. Above all, she is not a hidden principle or a thesis or a construct. She is there, a living voice. She takes us in.